So now when it comes to creating our container, we've kind of set up a nice little quick workflow for developing a Node or Express application in a Docker container. However, the command to run the Docker container, this command right here, is kind of long. And, I don't want to have to rerun this command every single time I want to get my container up and running. Although I'm sure you're thinking, well, you could just hit the up arrow key, so it's not a big deal. And that is 100% true. However, keep in mind when you're actually developing, like an Express application or some kind of Node application, you're probably going to have more than one Docker container, right? Right now, we're just building the Express server, but in a full-blown application, you might have a container for your database. You might have an Elasticsearch container. You might have another container for Redis. You're going to have multiple containers, right? And each one of those containers, you're going to have to run a command that's this long or potentially as long. And at that point, it starts to become a real hassle of getting your entire development environment up and running, and even getting your production environment up and running, because you're going to have to run 5 or 6 Docker commands. And you have to make sure there's no typos or anything like that. So what I'm going to show you guys is a way we can kind of automate all of these steps so that we don't have to run this monstrosity of command. And we're going to use a feature called Docker Compose, where we can create a file that has all the steps and all of the configuration settings we want for each Docker container. So we can say like, hey, I want to create a Node container using the image that I created, and I want to create a volume for the bind mount, and I want to create an anonymous volume. I want to pass in the environment files, and I want to open up these ports. So you can pass in all of these steps into a file, and then you can just run one very simple command to bring up, as many containers as you want. So if you have like 6 or 7 different containers in your development environment, you can bring up all 6 or 7 all at once with one command and bring them all down with one command. So let me show you guys how to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a Docker Compose file. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a new file. We're going to call this docker-compose.yml. So that stands for YAML. It's a certain type of syntax that you use. So what we want to do is, with your Docker Compose file, the first thing we have to do is specify the version that we're going to use. Now, if you go to this website right here, it's going to show you all the different versions of Docker Compose and the features that they support. Now, we're not going to do anything crazy, so I'm just going to use version 3, but if there's a specific feature that you need, then you're going to have to make sure you grab the specific version. This web page has a list of all the features that each version supports. So you can just take a look at this page and see what's the minimum version that you need to actually run all the specific features that you want. But I just default to version 3, so we'll say version, and then 3. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to specify all of the containers that we want to create. And so within our Docker Compose file, each container is referred to as a service. So we do services, and then we just specify all of our services. Now, this is very important. With YAML files, spacing matters. Okay, so we're going under services, and we're going to provide a list of all the different services that we want. So I want you to hit tab just once. And then here we're going to provide our container, or our first container. In our example, we just have one container, which is our Node app. And we want to give this container a specific name. You can call it whatever you want. We can say like, oh, my Node app, or we can call this Node project, whatever you want. Just give it a name. I'm going to call this Node app because that's what it is. And then colon, and then we're going to add in specific configuration settings for that container. So because we're going to do configuration for that container, I want you to hit one tab, and then I want you to start adding in the different configuration settings. So the spacing matters, unfortunately. So if I start moving things around, it's going to break things. So you want to do one space for each level. And keep in mind, if you have multiple containers, let's say you have a Postgres container, you would add a Postgres service. If you had a Redis service, you'd add one here. So this is how you add more containers or more services within a Docker Compose file. We just have one, so I'm going to delete these. Now, under Node-app, we have to specify a build setting. So what image are we going to use? Well, we have to build the current Docker file in our current directory. So we can say build, right? And then we pass in the path to our Docker file. So it's going to be our current directory, or whatever directory this Docker Compose file is. So this is just automating the Docker build command so that we don't actually have to do it. Docker Compose will do it for us. We just have to pass in the path to the Docker file. A couple other settings. Let me actually just hit up the up arrow keys to see all of the different options that we have. So we do need to expose a port. So let's open up a port so we can pass in the ports option. So under ports, one tab, remember. And here we can provide a list of ports we want to open. So for our container, we've only been opening up one port, but theoretically you can open up as many ports as you want. You do a dash because it's going to be a list of ports. And then here we're just going to do 3000:3000. You already know what that means. I'm not going to rehash that. If you wanted to add another port or open up another port, you can do that. So you can do like 4000:4000 as well, but we're just going to open up one port. So I'll delete that. Now I'm going to hit backspace again. So we're lined up with build and ports because once again, we're still under the Node app service. And here we want to pass in all of our volumes. So we'll do a volumes. And we're going to pass in our 2 volumes. And once again, this is going to be a list. So I want you to hit tab just once. And then we're going to pass in a dash. So the dash signifies a list. So the first one is going to be our bind mount. And the great part about this is that when you use a Docker Compose file, we can just do the dot syntax. We don't need to use this variables that I mentioned before. So we can just do /:, and then /app. And I think you can pass in RO if you want to be read only. I don't really care. Right. And then we need to pass in our anonymous volume, right? Which is this one right here. And that's that little hack that we did to make sure that we didn't overwrite our node modules folder. So we'll do /app/node_modules. And then last but not least, I'm going to add my environment variable. Doesn't really matter where you put it. So once again, line it up with build, ports, and volume. So we do environment. And we say dash. And then here you provide a list of environment variables. So we can do port equals 3000. All right. Keep in mind, in this case, this would be like the equivalent of running the environment variables one at a time. So let me see if I can find an example. So like this. However, we can pass in a file like we did down here if you want, so that we can use the .env file. And the way to do that would be, let me see, you can go down here and we can say env_file, and then we can say dash, you can provide a list of files, and then the path to the .env file. So whichever syntax you prefer, I'm just going to comment this out. I'm just going to use this because we just have one environment variable, so there's no need to import it in from an environment variable file. All right, so let's hit save. This has all of the settings that we need for our Node app service. And once again, if you're building a full-blown project, you're going to have multiple services. So you're going to see how this kind of really simplifies the entire process of getting your entire development set up and up and running, and as well as tearing it down all within one command. So make sure you save that. And what we want to do is we're going to run the command docker compose. So we do docker-compose. This is important, right? Don't do docker space compose. It's a different command. We want docker-compose. And then we want up. So that's going to bring up everything that's in our compose file. And then one important flag is if we do --help, let's see what options we have. We do have a -d flag, right? If you remember when we run our containers, we have to pass in the /d flag, or then we'll automatically attach to our containers, which we generally don't want. So we can pass in the same thing for our Docker Compose. So we can do Docker Compose up -d. So let's see if that works. So first thing you're seeing is that it's actually building our image. And so it's running, looks like I ran into, yep, that's just a warning. Don't worry about that. I think that's a, new patch. So that's just a vulnerability message. Don't worry about that. So it built our image. If we do a Docker image ls, you'll see that this is the image that it built. And notice the naming convention. What it does is it grabs the project directory, which I called node-docker, and then it passes underscore and then node/app. So the node/app is from the service name. So it took the project folder, did underscore, and then the service name. If we had one for Postgres, it'd be underscore Postgres or whatever we called it. All right, so it built the image, and then it also started our container. So if we do a Docker PS, right, you can now see that we have one container running. And it called it, once again, take a look at the name, node-docker, which is the project name, underscore, then the name of the service, and then there's an underscore one. I think if you have multiple, if you spin up multiple Node app services, I think it goes like 1, 2, and 3. I think that's why the one gets appended. But let's test this out. Let's just see if everything works. So going back here, if I hit refresh, looks like it works. And let's change our code. And delete the exclamation points just to make sure it updates. Hopefully it works. And it looks like that, guys. Everything works perfectly. So hopefully you guys can see how easy it is now to actually bring up our entire Docker environment with just one simple command. And bringing it up is just as easy as bringing it down. So now if you want to tear down everything, we can do, let's see, we just do docker-compose. Instead of up, I'm sure you can guess what the command is. It's just down. And just like when it comes to deleting Docker containers, by default, it will not delete those anonymous volumes. So if you want to delete the anonymous volumes with the Docker compose down, we can do a -v, and that's going to delete all the unnecessary volumes that it creates. So we'll do -v. And you can see it's stopping the Docker container. It's then removing it. Technically, when you run Docker compose, it creates a brand new network for all of your services. Don't worry about that. It's kind of outside of the scope of this video, but it does automatically create its own separate network so that it doesn't interfere with any of your other Docker containers. And you do get some extra features and perks when it comes to having a custom network like DNS so that you can reference names within your project. But don't worry about that for now. So now if we do a Docker PS, you can see that the container is deleted and everything's cleaned up for you. That's right, one command and you can start and stop theoretically hundreds of containers, right? Now, there is one thing I want to tell you guys. When we run the Docker compose up command again, what do you think is going to happen, right? Because if you take a look at the steps that took place when we ran it the first time, you can see it builds the image, right? It builds the image and then it starts the container. Now, if we run this again, I want you to tell me what you think is going to happen, right? Your natural guess is going to be that it's going to build the image again, and then it's going to run the container. Well, let's figure that out. Let's see what actually happens. If I run it again, look at this. The result was much quicker, and that's because it skipped the entire build process. It didn't build a brand new image. All it did was it created the network. I did tell you it created a network, and then it started our container. And the reason for that is that what Docker Compose does is it looks for an image. Docker, so if I do Docker image ls, it looks for that image based off of the syntax that I told you, which is project directory, and then the name of the service. And if it sees that that image already exists, it's not going to rebuild it. However, even if we make a change, right? Let's say we change the default port to be 4000. Oops. Right? This theoretically is now a different, it's a different image, right? We've changed something fundamentally in the Docker file, so it should rebuild the image if we run it again. So let me tear it down again. Let's do a Docker compose down. All right, and I think I saved it. I can never remember if I do that. And let's do a Docker compose up. So let's see if it rebuilds the image. And despite the fact that we made changes, it did not rebuild the image. So now we're essentially running a stale image, right? Why is it doing that? Like I said, there's just a simple dumb check that Docker Compose does. All it does is just look for an image named this. So if we do Docker image ls, we can see there's an image there. It has no idea that this is a stale image and that there's been an update. It doesn't know. Docker Compose is pretty dumb. It has no idea. So you have to basically tell it like, listen, I've made a change. I want you to rebuild the image. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, let me tear things down again. And let's go back to the Docker compose up command and let's do a -- help. And there should be an option that causes it to force a build. And let me see if I can find it. here we go, dash build. So this, when you run the dash build flag, it's going to tell Docker Compose to rebuild the image. Docker Compose is not smart. It does not know when it needs to rebuild the image. You need to tell it to. All right, so let's rerun this again. We'll do Docker Compose up -d dash build. This will force a brand new build. And there you go. So now we built a new image. Now it created everything, and everything should be working now. All right, so we can tear that back down. We can tear that back down. Change the default port to 3000. Save that, just so that we don't break anything else. And then if you want to, you can rebuild it again with the dash build flag. And so this will bring everything back up and rebuild it with the new default port. And everything should be working. So let's just double check. And yeah, everything's working. Perfect. But that's the idea behind Docker Compose. There's nothing too fancy about it. Obviously, you're going to have to take a look at the documentation to see other things, because eventually when you get a little bit more familiar with Docker and there's other settings or options or flags that you want to pass in, you're going to have to update the Docker Compose file to take in those parameters. So I just covered the basic parameters, but there's obviously plenty more within the Docker universe. Now, we're almost done. However, there's kind of one last thing. This is kind of a big thing, but you may have noticed that we're running npm run dev, right? So how do we actually go into production, right? Because right now when we run Docker Compose, everything is with respect to our development environment, because our Docker Compose, it creates that bind mount, which we would never want in production deployment, right? We don't need it to sync with anything. It's our production deployment, right? And our production deployment might actually use a different variable or a different port that Express listens on, or it could use the same one. I don't actually know. It's going to depend on your company or how you set up your project. But mainly also within our Docker file, it's not going to run npm run dev. Instead, it's going to run either, where's my package.json? It's going to run an npm start, or we can just run node index.js directly. So in the next section, I'm going to show you guys how we can set up our Docker Compose file so that we can have a separate set of commands for production and a separate set of commands for development.